Hello, and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. This program will celebrate breakthroughs like the vaccines that are speeding up the global recovery from COVID-19. It will shine a spotlight on innovators who are at the cutting edge of their fields. And it will help our global audience reimagine what's possible in science, technology, public policy, and more. Over the next 2 hours, you'll meet leaders in climate and agriculture who are proving that sustainability and economic growth really do go hand in hand. Congratulations to all the 2021 Bloomberg New Economy Catalysts, and I look forward to seeing you at the forum in Singapore this November.
Hello and welcome to the inaugural Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst program. I am your host, Anna Edwards, coming to you live from Bloomberg headquarters here in London. Over the next 6 hours, we're introducing you to a group of dynamic, visionary entrepreneurs, scientists and policymakers from all over the world. They are catalysts. They inspire new ideas, fresh thinking and novel approaches to old quandaries. Importantly, they incite action. At Bloomberg New Economy, we take a cautiously optimistic view of the future of humanity, informed by a wave of entrepreneurship accelerated by the pandemic. COVID-19 has cost millions of lives and destroyed countless small businesses around the world. But out of this catastrophe, a new economy is being born. The new economy puts the planet first. It prioritizes food security and access to healthcare and finance. It considers equity to be paramount. And revolutionary advances in technologies like AI, gene editing and robotics. Over the course of this virtual gathering, we will show you how our catalysts are tackling the world's most pressing issues in the areas of climate, agriculture, biotech, e-commerce, digital money and space. In this session, we will focus on getting to net zero carbon emissions and meeting the challenge of feeding 2 billion more mouths by the middle of this century. To kick off our climate-focused program, Planet Zero, we asked people from all over the world what should be the #1 climate priority for governments as they take steps to address the challenge of climate change in the year ahead. Take a listen to what we heard.
We have a unique and powerful opportunity to be the leaders that tomorrow needs to avert the worst of the climate crisis.
Unfortunately, what we face and what we see is a lot of greenwashing, a lot of fake news.
The #1 climate priority for government is to mainstream the climate ambition into the effort for green and low carbon recovery from COVID-19.
Então, pensar nesse momento de recuperação, de transição em empregos verdes, oportunidades verdes que garantam a composição e a estruturação de cadeias de valores.
We have to stop pretending that we are not part of a very intricately interconnected network of living beings. You know, we are of the planet as much as we are on the planet.
And let's face it, we all know that it's not developing countries that have emitted all the carbon that we're now trying to solve. So there has to be a fair and just transition, and that has to include, from the global north to the global south, much better cooperation.
What's critical for tackling the climate crisis is both pace and the depth of change that we're pursuing.
This transformational change needs the engagement of the different stakeholders and also to work with clear policies, long-term policies, and with specific instruments such as carbon pricing.
First and foremost, we will need to push energy efficiency across all our economies. We have the technologies to do so.
The next priority, I think, should be making climate education, environmental literacy a must and priority in our schools.
Some really fascinating answers there. Thanks to all who took to respond. Now, before we introduce you to our catalysts, I should explain that each segment of our program is divided into 3 parts where we seek to answer these questions: what matters, what's next, and what if. Join discuss the challenges, dive into the solutions, and really dream big about what's possible over the horizon. You will have the opportunity to participate in the conversation through the chat box and the polling that we're going to be doing, all of that on the right side of your screen if you are joining us on the platform, or through social media at #Bloomberg Catalysts. Before we get to our first panel then, I want to ask you, our audience, a question, our first polling question of the day. Do you think COVID-19 has made humanity more aware of the ever greater or the even greater catastrophe of climate change? Do you think, yes, blue skies during the lockdowns were a wake-up call? Would you say somewhat, investors and consumers are gradually forcing businesses to go green? Or would you say no, when the pandemic is over, it will be business as usual? So please do tell us your views. If you're on our platform, mark your answer to that question in the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll read out a little bit later on in our conversation. Now, for our first What Matters panel, we've got three great speakers lined up who are deeply engaged with climate policy and the active search for solutions. I'm pleased to say that we're joined by Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, Mayor of Freetown in Sierra Leone, which, like many cities in Africa, has large numbers of people living in informal settlements that can have a real impact on the natural habitat. Sarah Hanson-Young has been pushing a green agenda focused on preserving biodiversity in Australia, where she became the country's youngest senator. And we're also joined by Ma Jun. He is China's most prominent climate campaigner. He's best known for his work in improving water quality, but his thoughts go way beyond, of course. So please do get in touch with us. Please do send me your questions, and I will try my best to get those to the panel if time allows. We have 20 minutes or so for this first conversation, so please do get in touch if you would like to, and please do answer our polling question. Let's get to our panel conversation then, and let's go first to Mayor. Set up our conversation, if you could. Thinking then, Ma Jun, about the subject that we asked in our polling, and we'll get to the results shortly. Do you think that COVID-19 has sparked renewed concern globally about the far greater threat of climate change? How would you link COVID-19, the fight there, with climate change, Ma Jun? Get us started.
It's such a pleasure to join this conversation, and we all have seen the devastating catastrophe, devastating impact of this global pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And today I checked the number, the 180 million people have been affected, and with more than 4 million have passed away. And it's we feel so sad about that, and this whole pandemic has yet to be brought under control. We're racing against time to try to control it, and I hope that all over the world, each of us can all see, when a catastrophe really materialized, when a risk really materialized, how challenging for us to control that. And as you mentioned, that the climate impact, if that climate risk really materialized, it will be far more difficult for us to try to control, try to reverse the trend. So I'm happy to see, even during the pandemic, not just Europe continued to be the torchbearer, and U.S. came back, to Paris Agreement, but China, my country, last September, President Xi represented China to make the 2060 carbon neutrality pledge. I think this is very important, and I'm happy to see 120 countries now have joined this global race to zero, have committed to carbon neutrality. It won't be easy. We have more than 10 billion. So it won't be easy. We have to spare no efforts to achieve that.
It won't be easy. Yes, it won't be easy. A big challenge ahead, and we are, as you say, Marjan, still reeling in many parts of the world from the devastating impact of COVID-19. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, if I could come to you with a related question, then how do you link the two? How do you link the experience of dealing with climate change and the push toward dealing with COVID-19 and the push towards taking climate change threats more seriously? How optimistic do you feel about that?
Well, hello, and again, thank you so much for being involved in this program. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. And coming from Australia, of course, it adds even more weight to the fact that our nation needs to be playing a much larger role in helping to reduce carbon pollution and carbon target. And I must say right up front, much sooner than 2050. We are in the crucial decade right now. And some would say, oh, well, this is all too fast, this is all too soon. But what COVID has shown us is that when we are faced with such a crisis, with such chaos, leaders can listen to scientists and experts and come together and drive change hard and fast when we need to. I mean, who would have thought that this time last year that we would have had the vaccines that we have available now right around the world? And of course, we need more effort in making sure there is equitable distribution, and those who are really struggling get access to those vaccines now and faster and in the quantities that they need. But just the development of that over the last 12 months has been extraordinary. And I think you could roll out that type of response so quickly. And it's come because of leadership. It's come because the community has demanded it. And let me say right up front, it's come because politicians, people like myself, an elected member, and governments listened to the scientists and the experts and said, okay, you think we can do this, we will throw our weight behind you, let's get it done. That's the type of response we need now on the climate crisis. The technologies are there, the ideas are there, the public will is there. What we now need is that leadership from nation states.
Okay.
And of course, coming from Australia, there's a lot of effort being put in at the local level, at the state, at the provincial level, but not as much effort at the federal and national level, and that's where we need focus now.
Okay, and we'll certainly talk about that. And your point is well made, Senator, that the last year or two has certainly shown us what is possible, that big change can happen, big action is possible. Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, if I could come to you now, it's all very well for countries with deep pockets and huge financial resources to talk about what is possible on climate change. But has the fight against COVID-19 made it more difficult in many poorer countries, and I'm thinking here in particular about parts of Africa, made it more difficult to take bold action on climate because, you know, these economies are still dealing with COVID-19 and then they'll have to rebuild?
That's absolutely the case. And, you know, in many ways, it's predictable. There's a number of African countries, large amounts, mine not excluded, we're on a path to growth, a bumpy path, which even the way the global economy is structured can sometimes accentuate and amplify and increase existing inequalities. And what COVID has done, it has been to increase the number of people who find themselves in this position. So we know the statistics are telling us that we've got over 100 million people now who are added to those who could be considered to be in abject poverty. And those people are living in countries and economies which are struggling. The first and second waves of COVID were fairly kind to most of West Africa, certainly. I mean, we in Sierra Leone, my city, had less than 2,500 cases up until a month ago. But the third wave has been, and the economic impact of the first and second wave far exceeded the health impact. But clearly now we're catching up on both. It means that where we were already articulating the gap between the climate intentions and the financing to deal with that pre-COVID, that conversation is just going to become more difficult because you're talking about weak health systems, and you're talking about adaptation. And I think you said, or maybe it was Michael Bloomberg who said in his introduction, that the countries who are most affected by climate are the ones who contributed least. But the challenge we all face is that the concept of leaving no one behind.
I think we might have momentarily lost the mayor. We'll be back to her. We'll try and re-establish that connection and be back to her shortly. Really interesting points that she was making there, though, about the way that her campaign is being fought across Africa and the impact that is having. I'll take you to our poll results then. We asked of this broadcast, and we wanted to get a sense of how you, the audience, would join together the themes of COVID-19 and climate change. And these are the results. So we asked the question, do you think that COVID-19 has made humanity more aware of the even greater catastrophe of climate change? And this is really interesting in itself, the way that the results are really evenly split here. 34% saying yes, this was a wake-up call. 34% saying somewhat, not entirely sure. 31% saying no. When the pandemic is over, it will be business as usual. I suppose if you're an optimist, if you're looking to push forward, make progress on climate change, you could add the 34 in the and consider them maybe room to persuade a few more to join the yes camp. But anyway, those are the results from the audience. Entirely valid to get input and throw that into our conversation. I'll wait a little to see if we establish our conversation with Mayor Yvonne Akisoya, and I'll go back. I'll go to Marjan, very good to speak to you. And you talked in your opening remarks just a moment ago about how China has pivoted its approach on climate change, and it has now made this announcement that China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. What has driven that, do you think? Is this a wake-up within the Communist Party, the actions of climate activists? What is driving this change of approach from the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think this driving force is coming from the multi-stakeholders, not just the government. Of course, the Chinese government have pivoted its policy, but behind that, it's also the people. Years ago, when Beijing and the surrounding regions suffer from long stretch of smoggy days, when in a week that the airplane could not land and we could not quite see the other side, the next door building. People made their voice over internet and over social media, and this have motivated the government to come up with policy to monitor and then disclose PM 2.5 and then drive a national action plan on clean air, and this has opened way toward control the climate change because they, both carbon dioxide and the local emission came from the very similar sources. So through all these efforts, China's vast expansion of coal consumption have been brought under certain control, and through this approach, we have seen the Beijing's air quality improved significantly, and this has built the confidence that by going green, there's a way to try to decouple the growth from the pollution, and when China became the second largest economy in the world, it's also there's also a need for China to upgrade to try to achieve a much greener recovery. So I think all these are behind the thinking. Having said that, I have to say that pandemic have created a lot of world economic uncertainties. To hedge against that, many local regions unfortunately try to relax environmental control, so which resulted in a rather big rebound of our carbon emission. So I think this 2060 carbon neutrality pledge came at a critical moment. So now the challenge is how to bring this national ambition down to where those more than 10 billion tons of carbon are actually emitted. And we are tapping into the IT technology, big data, creating a blue map for zero carbon to try to help achieve that.
Yes, and you've been increasing transparency, I suppose, on the environmental questions in China, Marjun, around carbon emissions, around water quality. How is the national government on board with what you're doing, trying to shine a light on where action still needs to be taken?
Yes, there's we have seen a historical progress made in China's environmental transparency. More than 10 years ago, air quality, water quality, and the emission data from the corporations were not very acceptable. But we have developed the index to help assess the performance, and gradually we have seen a real big progress. The first year when we started gathering all this monitoring data, we can compile only 2,000 records. But today that violation records have topped 2 million. Now, because of all this online monitoring have been made public for the first time in the world. So every day our database can gather 3.5 million pieces of data, on air quality, water quality, and also the corporate discharge data every hour. And based on that, we turn that into the dynamic environmental credit assessment to more than 5 million companies in China. And this color code, even during the pandemic, I was most excited when during the pandemic, one of the largest state-owned banks decided to tap into this data to run through tens of thousands of the companies who want to borrow money from them. And so far, all this green supply chain and green finance application have motivated nearly 16,000 companies to openly improve their performance.
Okay. Transparency. Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, if I could come to you. We were hearing there from Marjun about how experience of about air pollution in day-to-day life was one of the drivers for change in China. What would you say the driver, or how have various drivers contributed to an urgent need for change on climate in Sierra Leone? I understand that there was a recent wake-up call when you saw the partial collapse of the Sugarloaf Mountain in 2017, which had really tragic consequences and a huge loss of life. How has that changed the climate change narrative in Sierra Leone?
About and people, it's that landslide you described cost the city or cost the country about $35 million. 1,000 people lost their lives in under 5 minutes. But this is becoming a regular occurrence. So there's a tension here. And I think it's important that we recognize that whilst we're not great emitters, so our contribution has been seeing the devastation of climate, which has led to abnormally heavy rainfall, unpredictable weather patterns, driven rural-urban migration, more people living in the city, cutting down more trees, that leading to more deforestation, leading to landslides, leading to water shortages. So it's a really vicious cycle of running away from the impact of climate change and then contributing to localized climate change and really poor air quality. So it's been really helpful. I mean, just the other day, yesterday literally, I had a meeting with Fridays for Future kids concerned about climate. And we have kind of narrowed it down. And this is why I say there's the tension. We've narrowed it down to one of our strongest messages to get people on board is to stop deforestation. But then you've got the economy. in, because sadly, in the last 3 years, we've moved from having mining as the major export to having timber as the country's major export. Timber going to China, interestingly enough. So how do we join these dots? How do we move away from, as I want to quote Greta here, mind the gap, the difference between what is being said in various climate circles and actually what we're allowing to happen. So if deforestation is being fueled by a demand for timber, and that itself is creating more pressure, of course, also reducing the carbon sink, but you're doing it because the jobs are not being promoted. A senator mentioned that at the local level, we are promoting in Freetown green jobs, but the national level,
Yes.
you see timber being promoted as the new economy. So these challenges, these dichotomies need to be addressed.
Okay, and let's get to Senator Sarah Hanson-Young next then. And Senator, the Australian government often frames the climate debate in terms of a trade-off between the environment and jobs. We heard Mike Bloomberg at the top of this hour talking about how he sees there's a path for sustainable growth going forward. And I know you've expressed that view many times. How do you square that concern, though, around the economy, around jobs, in an economy like Australia's, which is so reliant still on the mining sector, the extractive sector?
Well, thank you. Great question. And you're right. The Australian government and those who have really held back ambitious climate policy in Australia have always used this argument of it's the environment versus jobs. It's the same argument that was used in relation to native forest logging, funnily enough, throughout the 80s, 90s, and still continues in some parts of Australia. That if we don't log these trees, then people don't have jobs. The issue, of course, is that we are now getting to a crunch point where the cost of business as usual is now starting to create a burden on the jobs and the economy into the future. I'm thinking about is going to announce in the next week or so their rules for how they will deal with carbon adjustment at borders. So Australia is going to have to start to grapple with this. If we want to be trading with nations around the world, we have to start considering the extra cost that that's going to mean for our goods that are traded if we don't price carbon properly here in Australia, if we don't actually start putting proper checks and balances on reducing pollution. That is going to create an economic burden for Australia. Of course, we've got an amazing array here in Australia of renewable energy sources. We're the sunniest continent on Earth, and solar energy in particular is just abundant. Wind energy is amazing. We've got huge space to build renewable energy farms. That in itself would create an advantage for a country like Australia in green steel, other types of what would be usually quite intensive manufacturing and intensive energy industry being able to be run by very cheap, clean power. It's just about a mindset change. And at the moment, our policy in Australia is run by the interests of those big fossil fuel companies who are digging, mining and shipping overseas. Just one last fact before you throw off, because I think this is really important. Australia is the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world. So we might like to say that we can't participate and play a big role. But if we were to transition that export to clean energy, to clean resources, to clean goods, we would have a significant impact on the whole planet's climate.
Sarah, thank you very much. Thanks very much to Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. Thanks also to Mayor Yvonne Aki-Soya joining us there from Sierra Leone. And thanks to Ma Jun joining us in China. Thanks to all of you for joining me today. Really interesting conversation. I'm so sorry we don't have more time for it. And congratulations to you all on being named Bloomberg New Economy Catalysts. Now, hydrogen is a
Thank you.
trillion-dollar bet on the future. It could either save the planet or, skeptics say, become the world's biggest white elephant. Our next speaker is Zach Jones, the CEO and co-founder of C0, which counts Bill Gates amongst its investors. He is determined to use hydrogen to catalyze a green transition and speaks frankly with Bloomberg Green editor Aaron Rutkoff about the challenges and the opportunities. Take a listen.
All right, Zach, thank you so much for joining us here today. I want to ask you about C0. Your company is sitting at the intersection of things that are fascinating to my reporters, the promise of hydrogen-based technologies, the difficulty in dealing with methane. So if I understand it correctly, C0 allows natural gas to be used without producing carbon emissions. Can you give people a brief explanation for how exactly you guys pull that off?
Yeah, absolutely. So natural gas is a hydrocarbon. It's composed of hydrogen and carbon. And what our technology does is remove the carbon from the hydrocarbon, which leaves just hydrogen behind. So we effectively allow natural gas to continue to be used without making any CO2.
And then the hydrogen burns clean without any emissions that we associate with natural gas or oil or coal. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, the only byproduct is water.
And one question that comes up is where the carbon goes. So you are producing carbon, but it's not being released in the air. Where does the carbon go in your model?
Yeah, so it's actually, we remove the carbon as a solid. So we really kind of think of our technology as pre-combustion carbon capture rather than producing CO2 that you've got to compress, transport in a pipeline, inject into the ground, and then worry about whether it's going to leak for the next millennia or so. We've got a solid carbon that's much denser that you can really sequester just about anywhere. So we kind of think of it as pre-combustion carbon capture.
That's fascinating. I want to get back to the end result, but first I want to ask you, your company connects to all of the buzz that people hear about the potential of the hydrogen economy. There's as much promise as there is, I would say, skepticism around the potential for hydrogen. What do you think that skeptics get wrong about hydrogen?
I think that there's a lot of different applications that hydrogen can be used to decarbonize. And I think that thinking about it as a Swiss Army knife that can just kind of do everything is probably an oversimplification. But I do think there will be some applications where hydrogen really has a strong value proposition. I think one of those is making dispatchable zero-emission electricity to complement intermittent production from renewables like wind and solar. And what we allow is basically the connection between natural gas molecules in the ground today and a decarbonized, electrified future of everything, with part of those electrons coming from wind and solar and part of those coming from hydrogen. So I think that'll be a great application that's probably here to stay.
So if natural gas plants are today kind of handling that intermittency role when the sun isn't shining or when the wind isn't blowing, in the future, hydrogen made from C0 could be replacing it. One question I have about this process, does it take an abundance of cheap natural gas for your system to work? Many people are trying to push against the continuation of natural gas because of the impact that it has on emissions and leaked methane. Do we sort of need to have a lot of natural gas in our energy system in order for the C0 method to work?
We think of ourselves as really the bridge between the existing natural gas infrastructure and a decarbonized future. And one thing that I think gets overlooked is that there's kind of a view where, we're just going to stop doing everything we're doing today and completely start over again. And that's not really the way that energy systems or any systems evolve. I think it's going to be a gradual transition. And that's what's so great about our technology, is that we fit into the existing infrastructure rather than have to start from scratch, which is important for both cost and also time, too. I mean, climate change is really urgent. We need to reduce CO2 emissions as soon as we can. And so being able to utilize the trillions of dollars of infrastructure globally that are in place today is critical for both the cost and time components.
So on the time component right now, where is C0 in terms of its trajectory towards a commercial scale plant? Are you right now in the pilot stage, and how much hydrogen can you make today?
Yeah, so today we're kind of doing this at the lab stage. We're going to have our pilot online at the end of next year, and we'll be producing at commercial quantities at the end of 2024. But we've got some great investors and partners like Breakthrough Energy Ventures, ENI, and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries that we're really hoping will be able to accelerate the commercialization.
So since you brought up Breakthrough Ventures, I wanted to know if you could tell us what it was like going through the process of partnering with them and having them become an investor. They're one of the most interesting venture funds that we follow what they do. What was it like kind of welcoming them into your process?
Yeah, Breakthrough Energy Ventures team has been fantastic to work with. They probably have done the deepest technical dive of any investor that we've ever talked to. They've got experts from a number of fields, including our specific technology as well. And so it was fascinating and great to work with an investor that saw the big picture vision and could really talk with us on super technical terms. I mean, Breakthrough was involved when it was just our CTO and I sitting around a conference room at UC Santa Barbara. So they've been a great partner from the very beginning and continue to be.
And once you're up at commercial scale after the pilot launch at the end of this year, who do you see as the customers for the hydrogen that would be coming out of your process?
Yeah, great question. Really, we think of the potential customers for this as any customer who's currently using natural gas today for energy. So that could be a combined cycle power plant that's making electricity from natural gas. They can use hydrogen. That could be a refinery. Hydrogen is a big input into refining of gasoline and diesel fuels. So they could use our hydrogen in place of the very CO2 intensive hydrogen they're currently using today to help decarbonize those fuels without having to change over the infrastructure and the fleet associated with them. We've had a partnership with some utilities that want to go use our technology to decarbonize natural gas infrastructure, like pipelines, and deliver actual BTU content to customers downstream from hydrogen. So there's really no shortage of potential customers, and figuring out what market we want to start with is something that we'll be doing in parallel along with the technical development and launch of our pilot.
So if natural gas was a bridge to renewable energy, it sounds like the hydrogen made by C0 is a bridge away from that bridge, like a further bridge. One thing I want to talk about is, since your process is able to eliminate the carbon emissions associated with natural gas, the carbon you said in the end ends up in a landfill. Is that just like any other garbage going into a landfill? Is it safer? Is it something that we need to worry about leaking? Is there an environmental impact to the carbon byproduct of C0?
Yeah, well, we actually think about it being sequestered rather than landfilled. And while we don't ascribe any value to the carbon, there are some applications that we're looking at that could be interesting, either through naturally oxidative processes or through some kind of biological process. So it should be totally benign, if not a slight benefit in terms of its ability to absorb other sort of harmful things that might be leaching out of a sequestration site.
That's so interesting. Right now, when you look at the landscape of other companies in your space or other people trying to move into the hydrogen technologies, is there something that you see is very promising right now that's on the horizon?
I think one of the things that's really exciting about hydrogen is that it works very well with nuclear energy. And so if you're developing hydrogen infrastructure today, if some of the fusion companies are successful, or some of the small modular nuclear reactor companies are successful, you can use those technologies to generate hydrogen and keep using all the hydrogen infrastructure that's been developed in place. So I think some of those technologies are really exciting and interesting, potential hydrogen production pathways.
One last question I wanted to ask you. I know all the different hydrogen derived from different sources get different colors. What's the color associated with your hydrogen?
So we think of our hydrogen as being turquoise, in that it's a combination of green hydrogen made from renewable electricity and blue hydrogen, where CO2 is sequestered. We really think it's the best of both worlds. It's no CO2 is produced, and it's also low cost.
Well, great. Thank you so much for talking us through C0 today, and thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks very much.
Now we're going from an emerging technology like hydrogen to one that we're all just a little bit more familiar with, perhaps. China has brought down the cost of solar panels to the point that they're now affordable to almost everyone on the planet. Solar panels to off-the-grid communities in West Africa, offering solar power and devices using an innovative lease-to-own payment plan. This combination of fintech and green tech is changing lives in Sierra Leone and in Liberia. Let's go now to Bloomberg's Jess Shankelman, who is with Easy Solar, founder and CEO, and Tabiseng Mosia. Jess.
Us. So you finance miniature solar systems in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Can you just start by telling me what's the bigger challenge for your company? Is it the financing aspect or the technology of the renewables and the batteries?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me, first of all, Jess. Good to be here. So, I think the biggest problem we are trying to solve is one of energy access. So, 600 million Africans lack access. We operate in Sierra Leone and Liberia, you're really looking at more than 75% of people without access. And so for us, really, the technologies were already in place. And by and large, most of the consumers we serve are low income, are in very distributed areas across rural areas, and don't have access to finance a solar home system. And so in the absence of a grid and in the absence of money to finance solar home systems, what we really do is to make the energy not just accessible through a distribution network, but also affordable by financing these technologies. And so I think the big thing that is new and innovative and exciting is really going the last mile to consumers who can't afford it and making these systems affordable.
And what kind of innovations are coming down the line in this area around financing that really excite you?
Yeah, so I think the biggest innovation really is the smart technology of these systems, right? So you're talking about distributed generation systems start from like a basic solar lantern all the way to like more residential type solar. And in a lot of these systems now, you're having bidirectional communication. So what that means is if you have a full system, right, if somebody can't afford that system up front, you can shut it off remotely. So that allows people to pay a deposit basically at a level that they can afford. And then we do it on a rent-to-own financing system, so they can finance that over time. And there's no limitation to that, right? Because 90% of our customers are unbanked. They're in rural areas. Over half of them are what you would call below the bottom of the pyramid, so below the poverty line. And so these are people who have never been able to access a form of credit line. And so by financing one of our systems anywhere from like 6 months up to 3 years now, what they're able to do is really establish a credit history and become visible for the first time. So and so what we're able to do is not just limit them to like one system where we credit score them. And so you can start really with a basic solar lantern and upgrade to a solar home system, appliances, productive use, which is a really interesting thing that we're looking at now, actually getting people not just, household solar, but productive systems that can generate them income. And when you look at like 600 million people off grid and the majority of them being in rural areas, I think you're looking at a lot of untapped potential, and people have really not thought about what that means to have those people online and financially visible for the first time.
Yeah, because what you're saying suggests that might reshape people's lives in other ways as well, beyond energy.
Yeah, exactly. And we're actually looking at, we definitely see ourselves as more of like a power, we provide the power solution, but we also look at the devices. And so an interesting evolution that's happening in the industry, one thing that we're doing and also seen in Uganda is you're talking about integrated energy systems. And so, we distribution network and financing capabilities. And a big problem with mini grids is often, sufficient demand, especially in rural areas where you don't have like a big off taker or a big, industrial person to take the majority of the load. And so if you have these, distributed solar companies that have the financing capabilities, they're able to devices that increase, that demand on a mini grid. And so really we see ourselves as, really almost a hybrid player where we can provide the power solutions, but we can also drive up demand for power with other players in the sector like mini grids.
So I'm going to move on to a question about policy, because a number of European countries and also South Korea have said they're going to stop financing fossil fuel projects. Presumably that's very encouraging for you and your industry, but do you think countries in West Africa can actually leapfrog fossil fuels and just go straight to renewables?
So theoretically, yes, and I think it's definitely in the part of the industry, I think mindset should. But I also think it's important to look at where we are in history, and Africa is being asked to do something in a clean way and cost-efficient way at the same time, and sometimes those are competing realities. I do think that solar technology and renewable energy technology is becoming cost competitive, where in rural areas you are seeing the deployment of off-grid technology is really leapfrogging in some ways the traditional grid infrastructure. But I do think there needs to be an integrated approach. I don't think it's fair. And I think even when you look at the contribution of Africa to the climate crisis, I think there's two sides to the story. One is the energy transition, and by and large, there are 5 or 6 economies that have contributed 75% of global emissions. I think we should, justice in the energy transition. When it comes to developing, contributed 3% to global carbon emissions, since the 18th century. So really, I think, focusing and then sort of banning fossil fuels completely, I don't think is the solution. I think we need to get there, but I think we need to have a more of a complex view, and I think we need to have justice and climate, not just when it comes to our attitude towards the planet, but towards people who have been excluded from the monetary tool.
That's great, thank you. I'm having a few technical issues. I hope that everything's okay at your end. You recently spoke at the White House Climate Summit in April. And US President Joe Biden has made a huge play of coming back to the Paris Agreement. Do you see now that the US is doing enough? Have they put forward enough money to help developing countries deal with the worst impacts of climate change and invest in clean technologies?
So the short answer is no. So we know that off-grid investments last year were between 300 and 400 million. And what we need, there's different estimates, but anywhere between 11 billion to about 40 billion, depending on who you ask, in annual investments to get universal energy access by 2030. So we are nowhere near the level of investment that we need to leave nobody behind and achieve equitable and just energy transition and energy access. So I think a lot more needs to be done if you just look at the numbers. And yeah, I think there's a lot of players within the sector who are quite vocal. We are trying to think about like a blended capital stack. There's debt, equity, and grant moving definitely, but not at the level that it needs to be. I mean, we're a tenth less to get there and to leave nobody behind.
Well, perhaps by the end of this year, we'll get to that 100 billion goal that they've promised. And Tabi, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. I'm going to go back to Anna now in the studio.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Interesting conversation, Tabi, and to Jess Shankelman, Bloomberg's Jess Shankelman, and Tabi saying, Mozia, thanks very much, talking about the increase in access that solar can bring, but also increasing people's visibility as well. Now, single-use plastics are poisoning our rivers and our oceans. The long-term solution is to change consumption trends. But in the meantime, our catalyst, Simran Chowdhury, co-founder and CEO of Bluefin Technologies, is working on robots that vacuum up plastics and other pollutants floating on the surface of our waterways. Bloomberg New Economy's Kathleen Glass spoke to Simran about how these machines work.
Congratulations, Simran, on being named one of our Bloomberg New Economy Catalysts. I want to start by asking you a question about a study published in the online journal Nature Sustainability just this month. The study estimates that there are 5.25 trillion particles of litter at a minimum currently floating in our oceans. Your company, Bluefin, aims to cut that number down. Tell me how that works.
So thank you very much. It was an honor being selected. Bluefin essentially is a robot that collects waste and water. And the waterways that we target are river, canals, and coastlines because these are the large, they're the reason that waste is essentially carried out to our ocean. And so by implementing Bluefin as a preventative measure in these locations, we would be able to reduce the amount of waste that ends up in the ocean in the first place.
Tell me just more about how it works. It floats on the surface of the water and pulls trash right out of there. How does it know? It's a smart robot.
Right. So Bluefin essentially, we don't have any sort of pulling mechanism. We tried to keep it as simple as we could. And so Bluefin essentially goes towards the waste to collect it. And this is where also operation planning becomes very interesting for us, because in some waterways, you'll notice that waste automatically comes out to the sides. And so then we focus on only collecting, like running Bluefin in a way where it's essentially collecting waste along the sides and in the corners. Bluefin also does, and we are working on like a waste detection algorithm. So Bluefin would be able to recognize and optimize this operation when it's running and collect the most waste in that location.
And you're working on doing kind of adding new additional features to the robots, right? Tell me a little bit more about kind of like the water testing, the pH testing that you do, and sort of liquid waste removal that you're working on.
Our shift to this modular design came with expanding Bluefin's use cases. And this would allow us to, like you said, assist in oil spill collection, also assist in biomass removal, which would be things like algae and water hyacinths. Bluefin, even with its first prototype, has enough space to be packed with like multiple sensors. And this is where, water quality testing in terms of pH, temperature, and turbidity can be incorporated.
Who is your target customer for these robots? And I guess, in other words, who are the kind of the worst offenders? Where is the problem most dire?
So research has shown that the problem is worst in locations where waste management practices are not being implemented properly. And so a lot of rivers in India, a lot of rivers out of the Philippines, these are sort of our two primary locations to go out and put Bluefins in to start with, and then sort of scale to other locations.
We're coming out of the pandemic now. Do you feel like the pandemic has maybe made things worse in terms of plastics emptying into the ocean? Certainly with the rise of e-commerce, there's a lot of extra packaging. What do you think?
I think it's been a combination. There's also a rise in using plastic masks, PPE kits, and gloves because everyone's worried, and fairly so. And so, like you said, e-commerce, I think the pandemic has also been great in helping people realize what climate change is. I think there was a lot of people that were able to deny its existence. And during lockdown, they saw the world heal itself. They saw the footprint that human beings were having on the planet. And so I think it was a combination of both.
What role do you think technology should play in solving climate change? I mean, is it really mission impossible to clean up plastics in the ocean? Or is the real answer kind of we need to combine cleanup efforts like yours with, lifestyle changes or government regulation, like removing single-use plastics from use? What do you think is the solution?
I think the most effective solution is going to be taking a more approach. No matter how small your action is, that action is going to have a ripple effect and contribute to the larger picture, especially in the form of policy, in the form of potentially carbon tax, in the form of solutions like Bluefin. We need to see a lot more inventions for climate technology. It is very much possible that the invention or the innovation that will solve climate change has not even been invented yet. And so there needs to be a lot more support of climate tech.
Yeah, I mean, are there other transformational kind of innovations that you're excited about right now? Like, like you say, the solution may not have been invented yet. What kind of excites you most? What are the things that you're seeing happen out there that give you a lot of hope for what we can do against climate change?
I think there's a lot of innovation that's gone into renewable energy. a lot of more efficiency that's come in for countries to be able to adopt it at a significantly larger space and completely able to go off of coal or fossil fuels. In the UAE alone, we've seen, huge solar parks come up which will hopefully also make the economy less reliant, or more reliant rather, on clean energy.
What would you say your end goal is here? How would you define success for your company?
I think the metric for success would be to cease to exist. Hopefully there will be no waste in the ocean for us to clean up.
And do you have a timeline on that?
I'd like it to be as soon as possible. I feel like we needed a lot of things done yesterday, and so every single day we're trying to catch up on that.
Simran Chowdhury, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I mean, in the beginning, I just tried to talk myself out of starting this business because it really didn't make sense in that time of the world. But the more I looked into climate change, the more I understood what a humongous problem it is going to be. And I just had no choice. About 2 years ago, nobody was really interested. They didn't think that it would be a good business. They didn't really see the money in it. That's all changed so rapidly. Everybody and their grandma is calling themselves a climate investor now, which is fantastic. I'm Henrietta Moon. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carboculture. And Carboculture is removing atmospheric carbon by turning biomass waste into highly stable carbon that remains stable for 1,000 years. Most life on Earth is carbon, and it's our fourth most abundant element, so it's not bad per se. We just have it in the wrong place, in too much scale. So we need to think of the most elegant way to actually bring down that carbon from the atmosphere and put it to use somewhere where we can use it better.
This challenge is at the core of Carboculture's mission. The Helsinki-based startup is focused on solving the Earth's carbon problem while offering a viable business model, one that didn't even exist at the beginning of her career.
I ended up in this crazy program that was a 3-month intense program at NASA Ames in California, and that's where I met my co-founder Chris Carstens. Back then, there was no price on carbon. Emission trading was at maybe €5 a ton, and nobody was really interested in pursuing that as a business model. We got started properly in 2017. Today, the carbon market is trading at over 10 times that, so times have changed.
Henrietta and her team turned to nature itself for inspiration on how to make this model both effective and profitable.
Every year, nature draws down carbon in the form of photosynthesis into all our biomass, trees and plantations and crops and everything you see. But naturally, when that biomass, like the trees, die, they decompose and re-enter the atmosphere again. And that's the natural carbon cycle. At Carboculture, we were trying to figure out what is the most elegant way to actually draw down some of this carbon. And instead of trying to invent machines to take out parts per million from the atmosphere, we decided that millions of years of nature already knows how to do it. So if you see a forest today, and in 500 years, it'll essentially be the same size. It's not going to 10x its carbon removal capacity or grow 10 times larger. So we have these solar-powered allies who use photosynthesis and turn this carbon from the atmosphere into biomass. And we take that biomass, such as nutshells or peach pits or tree waste, and we put it into our patented reactor, and we rapidly take it to ultra-high heat where it carbonizes. It doesn't decompose, it's not eaten by microbes or anything, and we can store it safely in the soil. By doing this, the carbon, that's almost pure carbon, remains stable from 1,000 years to, let's say, maybe up to 1 million years.
Their first facility resides in California, which operates as a proof of concept to demonstrate the process.
Basically, we put biomass in there and we put them inside. We take them to an ultra-high temperature, about 1,000 degrees Celsius for a split second. And in that time, the biomass carbonizes. So it turns into a charcoal-like form. You can mix it into compost or put it in the soil or use it for water filtration or just bury it in the ground in an old mine shaft or something. Our technology is like On a basic level, the same thing as turning wood into a carbon is something that everybody can do in their home fireplace, right? But now if you want to make it like ultra efficient and actually store the carbon away, now it gets a little bit more difficult. But the kind of principle is the same. Right now our batch takes about 2 hours for a half a ton, so we can do about 500 pounds per hour, let's say, of biomass.
Now that they've mastered the concept, it's really just a matter of scaling it up by a factor of 1 million or so.
If we put 1 million of these systems around the world, we can actually use part of the energy in the biomass itself to power these systems. And in this way, we're helping the green transition of the grid instead of hindering it. This next scale up at scale would remove about 13,000 tons of carbon dioxide annually. So make a few thousand tons of biocarbon. And that's a big step for us.
Though Carboculture has recently raised $6.2 million in seed financing, it will take a lot more funding to get Carboculture's vision to scale. This Herculean effort will require investments from both public and private sectors. And now that carbon capture programs like this are beginning to get traction, Henrietta welcomes the competition.
If we look at the big picture, we have a North Star mission of a gigaton of removal, which is 1 billion tons. And it's a real insanity target. It's definitely not easy. It's light years away from where we are today. But for us, it means that we also need to get to that kind of a scale. And there's probably going to be 10 to 100 companies like us in maybe a decade from now that will be trying to get to that gargantuan scale that is needed.
Climate catalysts. Now we turn our attention to agriculture, which account for gas emissions. That's about the same amount as energy generation. There's no more pressing challenge facing the planet than changing our farming practices and perhaps our diets. New technologies now make both of those goals more achievable. Our next What Matters conversation is with Grow Intelligence founder and CEO Sarah Menke. She is using AI to collect data the world needs, essentially, to shift towards a more efficient and sustainable global food system. Bloomberg TV and radio anchor Carol Massey spoke to Sarah about how she's using big data to build predictive models around agriculture.
Well, Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. Let's get right to it. Tell us about Grow Intelligence, the work you're doing, and why you're doing it.
Yeah, Grow Intelligence is a company I founded in 2014, and it really is a story at the end of the day that tells the story of what on Earth is going on. And I say that because, oftentimes we use data to tell stories. And oftentimes when we think of Earth, we think of satellite images just showing us pictures of our Earth, whereas Earth is sort of this interplay between our Earth's actual ecology and our human economy and the interrelationships between the two. And what we've done is we've built a data platform using artificial intelligence to capture sort of data around the world about our Earth, as well as our human economy, connect the dots and start to tell stories about things like, where the trajectory of food security is going, or how to become better resilient to climate change. And really, it's a company focused on tackling these two major problems, which is essentially around food security and climate change at global scale.
Huge issues, right, that obviously impact everybody. Data collection can be good, it can be bad, right? It can be biased. So tell me how you go about it.
Yeah, it's garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
And so we say curated by human intelligence, scaled through artificial intelligence. And I think this is a really important part of how we do our work, but how AI should be done, which is that you need domain experts, you need humans that first actually assess the data in the very early days. Because as you're collecting data and you're getting data, we get data from over 45,000 different sources around the world, and it comes in many
Government,
languages.
private, public, everything.
Governments, private companies that we license from, trade organizations, all sorts of, and then they come in many different formats and languages. And you need human experts initially that sort of do the assessment of the data, that document it, that map the definition of it, that help create the dictionary. And then you start to use artificial intelligence to scale the mapping of that knowledge to better understand the interconnectedness that exists through the data. But it always really starts with the human intelligence component that helps with sort of the curation in the beginning.
Right.
And then you let the machines take over. And this makes your predictive models work better. It makes the knowledge graphs, the systems of sort of how we understand today work significantly better as well.
It's a diverse group. I know, speaking many different languages.
Very. Yes.
But it's good, right? Because you're dealing with a global issues.
Yeah. I always say, your team has to resemble the world it's attempting to model.
I can hear your commodities background playing into this. What was it about your background in commodities and being in the Wall Street financial community that kind of got you to where you are today and said, all right, there are bigger issues, bigger problems. We need the tools to tackle it.
Yeah, I mean, it played a huge role. I was an energy trader. And in the early days of sort of energy trading, if you had an oil producer that would come to the market and say, I've discovered oil and I need to now produce this oil and I need some money for it. So therefore I need to sell it forward to you. And selling oil 2 years forward used to be a struggle. By the time I left, oil producers, gas producers, et cetera, could sell oil 10, 20 years forward, long before it was outside the ground. Financial markets enabled that. And, for markets to develop, you need trust, you need baseline understanding, and then people have their relative competitive advantage, right? Because what that does is it drives capital into markets, and capital drives innovation, and innovation drives very long-term change. Renewable energy, shale oil, shale gas, all of these technologies we take for granted had to be funded some way. And I had seen that agriculture was, and still is, frankly, where maybe energy markets were in, if I'm being kind, like the early 90s.
So they were behind, right?
They're very behind.
Right.
And so, when you think of what happened in COVID last year, during COVID, and all of the shocks the system experienced when, people were saying, are we running out of meat? Why are, certain things just flying off shelves? And is there a shortage? That was really a function of how short-term the food markets actually behave, meaning decisions are still being made day to day, week to week by grocers. And if you take the most liquid agricultural market in the world, which is corn in the US, you're lucky if you can sell it 2 years forward, right? So that to me is how do you drive structural change around that?
Well, it's interesting you bring up the pandemic too, because there were many people that were forecasting we were going to have some kind of health pandemic for years. And yet it was, a tragedy and we were caught off guard. Are we kind of doomed as a society, or as you do the work that you're doing, are we providing the tools that can help people be better prepared? Because when we think about the climate or we think about food accessibility, I'm hearing from major players in the industry that, they're looking at maybe a few years or a couple of decades where we could be facing some really difficult situations in feeding the world. We already are, actually.
Yes. I mean, the biggest topic today around the world is food inflation. I mean, inflation is a major sort of a point of sort of stress for every major economy around the world, including the US. But in the US, it's a little more transient. In places like Brazil and Russia and China and all around sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, you're looking at, year-on-year food basket prices being up 20, 30, 40%,
right,
on top of major currency devaluations. Like, we are not in a good place as a world today, as it is when it comes to sort of the fragility of our food systems. And to that, you add climate shocks, which is the frequency, because when we think of climate change, there's, sort of like the first part is obviously, yes, it's warmer temperatures, but it's what is the distribution of that?
Right.
And what's the volatility associated with sort of the weather patterns themselves. And so when predictability goes down, that's never a good thing for society, right? And so I do believe companies like Grow are doing our part in trying to sort of open people's eyes. And that's why I say it's like the story of what on earth is going on. Because when you're talking about food security, it is about better understanding our food systems as a real world system, a live, living, breathing system with many different nodes that are interacting and thinking of it that way. And when it comes to climate change, it's about better understanding, under different CO2 scenarios, because it's data is the world sharing its experience, and it's a, chronicle of the past, the present, and the future. The past and the present are certain. We know them. The future is only probable.
Right.
And with climate change, it's a set of probable outcomes that we need to manage for. And that requires a huge amount of translation of science into actionable insights.
Right.
And I think we're getting there, but it's how do you drive change? How do you get people to do that?
Well, and that's what I wanted to ask you. I mean, talk to us a little bit about the clients that you work with. I mean, they are getting these data sets from you. They have specific, problems that they're trying to tackle, a lot of it with climate change, a lot with food accessibility. Is it making an impact? Are people taking the data and taking the actions to improve the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, and let me talk a lot about sort of three segments of clients we work with. First is sort of corporates. And when I say corporates, I talk about, very small companies that are trading in one or two agricultural products pretty locally to some of the world's largest corporations that are sort of central to our food systems. And what we're doing with sort of the bigger corporations is saying, how do you actually operate differently? How do you understand sort of end to end your supply chains better and better sort of build resiliency? You increase your margins as a business, but you also increase sort of predictability in terms of assurity of supply and prices that you can produce and all of that, right? And so it's really sort of about changing operations, helping drive R&D towards where the future of food is going, right? Because you're investing billions of dollars thinking about what's next in my pipeline.
And you want to be on the right
Exactly. The second segment of customers are actually governments, because food security is national security.
We saw ag nationalism, right, during the pandemic, where producer countries didn't export, right, because they had to protect their home countries.
And we're only seeing more of it now. I mean, Argentina just this week extended its ban on beef exports until the end of the year. And China's its biggest market. So you have these really big interdependencies, but you know what? The thought of riots within a country is scarier than getting more US dollars, which you desperately need. When a country that has a currency crisis bans exports, that tells you everything about sort of the state of the world, right? And so we're working increasingly with governments around how do you build food secure systems when it's dependent on global trade? Like, we are an interconnected system, and it's international. How do you do that? And how do you sort of build AI powered, food security systems for nations?
So you said you have companies, you have governments,
and then financial institutions.
Yeah.
And with financial institutions, it's sort of, it's a multitude of things, right? Sometimes it's just, here's a bunch of data and you're going to do something with it, and we have no idea.
Right, exactly. But I bet they're very interested, right?
But the bigger thing we're doing with financial institutions, which really excites me, is using a subset of the data that we have around climate and understanding climate phenomenon like drought, floods, climate volatility, etc. And we're working in bringing together some of the world's largest financial players together to launch an entirely new asset class around climate, so that we can better not just measure climate risk, but manage it my fear about climate change today is that there's a lot of conversation about what reporting we want.
Right.
But reporting is a tax. And so how do you manage that reporting? How do you manage that risk? So it's one thing to know that you can quantify it, which we can help do. But the second is we need to prepare financial markets for how that risk will be managed. Otherwise, it is doomsday.
It does feel like we're just at the beginning of that, where we're thinking at, when you look at a company, it's not just, I don't know, consumer demand or, you know, those kind of fundamentals, but we're looking at things like climate change and what impact that ultimately, whether it's the insurance industry, whether it's a food company, right? These are big factors.
Yeah, and I say, you know, take clean energy, for example, hydropower. You could invest as an investor and give it a very high E score because it's clean energy.
Right.
But what if and it has great management teams. So say it ticks the boxes on sort of all the components of fundamental investing. But what if the assets of the power plants are located in places that are going to be prone to drought in 10 or 20 years? We have to start thinking about, you know, all of these things holistically and manage better around these risks.
So what matters when it comes to the work you're doing? How do you think about it? Is our existence at stake? What is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, what matters is, are we measurably moving the world forward in a positive direction? And are we, you know, doing it in a way that is neutral? I mean, neutrality has mattered so much to me as a company because you cannot be trusted by everyone if you are overly aligned with someone. And so we work with all players, we work with competitors. And to me, moving things forward is sort of getting systems that don't necessarily fully trust one another to work better together. Because that's how I still believe the solution ends up in capital markets. But it's how do you sort of drive that change?
I mean, money drives change.
Yes.
Ultimately, investment money drives change. I want to ask you too, though, because you're using data and we're living in an era where big data, where companies that have amassed a lot of data are often looked at warily and skeptically. How do we have to make sure that technology data, you use so much data, is not misused?
Yeah.
And helps society and doesn't hurt society?
I mean, trust is a big factor, right? You have to learn to be trusted. Neutrality is the first part of it. The second part is transparency. I think for a long time, data companies, AI companies, sort of live in a world where everything is their secret sauce and nothing can be shared. We as a company have taken a very opposite approach, which is we're very much an open book with those that we work with. We share our modeling methodologies. Because
that's
our
really peeling
sort
it
of
back.
It is, and part of it is like saying, you know, you sort of want, you know, the ingredients, the recipe, the baked good, and the cherry on top. And you can get any of that combination from us. And most times people want the baked good with the cherry on top,
right?
But they feel safe if you have knowledge of what the ingredients are and what the process was, right? And so that is really where I think humanizing AI, humanizing data becomes really sort of important. But ultimately, it's up to companies to earn that trust. It shouldn't sort of be a given. And it's something that you have to just, as I think as CEOs, like we have to actively work on.
I'm curious because the outcomes, what are you seeing so far with the companies you work with, the government you work with financial institutions? I know that's kind of a newer part of what you're working on. What are the outcomes so far that are maybe moving the needle in a better direction when it comes to climate change or food distribution or food sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think about in companies, the change we're driving is the stuff that excites me. I mean, there's lots of stuff that we do that's much more sort of like operationally making companies better, which is really important.
Right.
But the really exciting stuff is helping them rethink sort of future supply chains and how do you
see that
create?
Happening.
Yes, because we work actively with companies of how do you create better sustainable supply chains for healthier foods, which today is a very complicated problem to solve for, because healthier and more nutritious foods tend to be produced in smaller quantities and tend to be more expensive. And so how do you sort of crack that affordability code in the process of going down the sustainability path, right? And that like really sort of excites me, because it is bringing the world of sort of food security and climate change into one.
Equitability.
But really, hopefully, yes, doing it in an equitable way. Because to me, it's not just about having an abundance of food in the world. It's about having an abundance of affordable and nutritious food. And that is a very hard problem to solve for.
One last question. In terms of, because you are collecting so much data and you're getting it from so many different sources, is there something that, some data points or something that you could get, a collaboration that would help you push what you are doing even further in terms of a mission of helping out the climate, helping out our food chain?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one area we've been really sort of focused on is health and food safety as it relates to climate change. Climate change is going to change the face of human health, just like nutrition, everything from the basics of like allergens, you know, and allergies to some more complex diseases. And it's also going to change the safety of our foods. So one thing that people don't understand is that extremities in climate volatility means that sometimes you could produce the food, but the food might have higher toxin levels than what is safe for humans to consume. And we know how to model these risks. And one of the things where we're now working on is getting companies to trust us with their data to sort of validate our models, because the companies actually sit on the human health data. They sit on the food safety data from what they test in labs. And we're sort of working with them one by one. But how do you sort of collaboratively get them to understand that the collective outcome of understanding this together is better, more impactful, and actually probably better for everyone's business as well in the process. But like, it is, to me, the thing that worries me is the intersection of sort of climate change with food safety and human health, and solving for that is going to be critical.
Well, listen, we've realized in the last year, right, so much is interconnected, and we need everybody's work on these massive problems. You're a catalyst for change. We are seeing it. Sarah, thank you so much. Really
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Interesting conversation. Now let's stick with the theme of food. A lot of people want to eat less meat, but they don't necessarily want to give up on the textures and the flavors that they've grown to love. For our first What's Next interview, Matthias Muchnik, the founder and CEO of Notco, is using AI-driven algorithms to analyze plants at the molecular level to find an exact match for the tastes of the foods we know and love. Bloomberg New Economy editorial director Andy Brown asked Matthias, a former investment banker, about how he got to be an expert on plant-based ice cream and burgers, and why some of his biggest fans are in beef-heavy countries like Argentina and Brazil.
Matthias, you're a vocal critic of the global traditional food industry. In fact, you once described that industry as being similar to the 2008 global financial crisis. What are the similarities?
Well, as a finance major, you very well said it. It's I understood the industry back in 2008 to have this few big companies selling overly complex products to consumers that were totally disconnected to what they were buying, and where regulators became deregulated. All of those red flags are in the food industry, you know. And my first approach was, what is broken in the system? The system of a lot of confusion. When you got into a store and you got out more confused than you went in. One day eggs are good for you, the next day eggs are bad for you. One day milk is good for you, the next milk, you know. And whenever you have an industry so big that is so confused or generating so much confusion, it's because that industry probably is not based on science. So when I get there, I basically understood that the biggest problem of the food industry was that it has been operating under an obsolete technology for the last 50 years. And the consequences have been vast in terms of environmental impact, in terms of use of resources and efficiency of the use of resources to create nutrition for this growing population, and where the technology that we have today can make practically whatever we want. So if we take the animal out of the equation, how this equation will actually look like, how the food system would actually look like, and it's the difference is incredible. If we ate everything that comes from plants, we basically would transform a food industry that is today the common denominator to every major environmental ill known to humankind into something relatively efficient and relatively good for the environment, good for you and good for the environment. So to me, it was a no-brainer. But technology and science should be actually fixed in a system that doesn't use it.
So at the heart of your technology and science-based approach to food is a artificial intelligence algorithm. And this algorithm analyzes food at a molecular level and, you say, recreates all of the flavors and textures of traditional food. Are they exact matches?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one thing that we needed to do in the food industry is that we need to understand the food that we love to eat. We don't understand it. We have no idea how to describe it. What's the real data that would allow us to understand or to make a software understand what mayo is, what a piece of meat is, why does it have the taste that it has related to the functionality, related to, the experience, and what's the difference between, each meat that makes the human being like it more or less. Like, we needed to understand what food actually was. And there was poor understanding. But on the other side, there was poor understanding of the more than 400,000 species of plants in the world that exist. We had no idea what 99% of them can do. So we have no idea if the combination of pineapple and cabbage can recreate the flavor of milk, right? And that for a human being might sound super crazy, but for an algorithm, it isn't, because it's an unbiased powerhouse that generates kind of like these crazy combinations that you would never think about. So we lacked of innovation, we lacked of technology, and we lacked of science. So what we did was basically understand the food that we love to eat, understand this world of plants, and we design an algorithm allow us to predict which combination of plant-based ingredients and how do we need to combine them in order to generate the flavor, taste, color of a traditionally animal-based product but coming from plants, right? So in that way, we're kind of like replicating what we love to eat without any sacrifices, but doing an absolute wonder for the industry, for the environment, for the use of resources. So is it exactly the same? Yeah, and not even the same. Sometimes it's even better. So we've tasted our product, which is, our plant-based, for people that are not vegans, not vegetarians. They have no restrictions whatsoever, and they love our product better than the original, let's call it, and at this point of time, original product. So yeah, I mean, we could talk, all day about it.
It's pretty clear that business as usual in the consequences of business as usual in the food industry are potentially dire. Agriculture accounts for as much as a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. Big picture, how can plant-based food save the planet?
Well, if you think about it in like kind of an engineering approach, we've been feeding plants to animals in order to generate our milk, cheese, eggs, and meat. If you cut down the animal, out of the equation, everything changes, right? The amount of water, energy, soil that you need to give these animals in order to produce the food, it's vast. If you take the animal out of the equation, you produce everything out of plants, you will be reducing exponentially the use of resources and the environmental impact. Let's remember that really, the environmental impact is something that has been, so undermined by creating this food system around us, that we were blindsided by how aggressive this was until very recently. And I think this is something important to actually mention, which is the connection to the new consumer, right? New consumers were born and raised with the idea of sustainability. We weren't, right? We sat on the table and probably had what our parents said that we needed to have, and they were convinced that milk made us stronger, and and meat was something very important in our everyday meal. And now a kid actually understands what lies or what relies behind your cheap meat on the plate. It's really mesmerizing. So I definitely think that it also has to do with education, which is, at this point of time, very, very important for the shift of consumer preference.
So millennials and Gen Z are your core market. Presumably they're as angry, as outraged as you are at the traditional food industry. But let me ask you this: why don't you come up with an entirely new suite of products with new tastes, new flavors? Why don't you try to hook a new generation on different food? Why try replicating the old stuff that apparently isn't very good for you?
Yeah, this is a great question. So this was our first approach. We humans are beings of we repeat and tend to repeat, and food is way more than just food. It's occasions of consumption, it's culture, it's your connection through the love of your grandma, your mom, your dad. It's something way stronger that we actually think. It's not just food. It's way more than that. And so when we said let's replace what we love, let's not change the way we make the food that we love to eat, or let's not change the food that we love to eat. Let's change the way we make the food that we love to eat. That was our mission since we started all of this. And you can only do that without sacrifice. People, really want to. I mean, there's a natural reason. There's a scientific reason why we love milk. There's a scientific reason why we love meat, right? And so we started off by saying, let's replicate with plants what we already love that comes from animals. That will be doing a significant change for the industry. And then let's work on something to introduce a new suite of products that we never thought of before. So that's definitely on the pipeline. But at the beginning, it was like, and again, it has to do with the brand as well. Calling not something, not burgers, not milk. The human brain is not able to process negatives. Right. So it always takes you to it's like, don't think about an elephant. You think about an elephant. Right. So that takes you to an occasion of consumption is easier because you don't need to educate on the occasion of consumption, on the taste, and so on. So we started off going into the new products.
So you are defiantly anti-establishment. You talk about your products, not burger, not meat, not mayo, and your company name, not Co. How did you come up with that?
Yeah. Well, it has two different pillars of how we created this brand. So one is probably, it's a it's a criticism to the system, right? Probably everything, Andy, that you think you're eating today is not what you think you're eating, right? So everything should be at the end of the day called not. Your yogurt that you think it's yogurt, it's not the yogurt that you think it is, right? So in our case, it was like everything should be called not. Let's be honest about it and just tell the consumer it's not what they think it is, right? And the other one was, there's a general nuance in this industry that the food system is broken. And you could talk with, high income consumers, low income consumers, they know there's something going on behind the industry and something really wrong about it. And so telling not straightforward, people understand it. It's incredible.
But Matthias, even though you make a big deal out of critiquing and taking on the big players in the food industry, at the same time, you're collaborating with them. Burger King is a partner for you in Latin America. How does that work?
Well, since the get-go, we also understood that we needed to become these catalyzers of change. We're not going to change everything by ourselves. There's no way we can do that at the pace we really want to. There's these big brands that have a lot to say about this too. I mean, either they kind of like try to really ban you and cut you out, and we've seen this many times with lawsuits against plant-based companies, and they never win because the consumer is driving what is good, what is bad, and so there's others that actually join you, say this is the future, man, and if we don't join NotCo, we're going to be outplaced like Blockbuster did against Netflix. And you find those brands that really want to kind of like generate the brands of the future, and they are open to actually work with you. They are open to actually learn from you, and they say, okay, I mean, you might be right, so let's go for it. And that's it. We hold hands, we change with partners, and that's the way we want to maintain ourselves also going forward.
How big could the market in plant-based food grow? Do you think it'll make a significant dent in the animal-based food market, or will it remain niche?
No, I mean, I can give you a few examples. I mean, in the burger product, we launched in Chile 10 months ago, 11 months ago, and we already have 5% of market share of the total burger market. 5% in only 10 months of sales. So that speaks to me into a dimension of market penetration of plant-based products that hasn't reached the peak, not even close to that, right? It's accelerating, unbelievably fast. The US only grew 24% in the plant-based industry versus 2% growth in the animal industry last year. And COVID accelerated this adoption of plant-based foods because today, younger generations are convincing their dads on changing, and it's absolutely incredible, and that's happening. And so it's not niche, it's going to become mainstream. Probably it's not going to take 100% of the industry, but at least in the next 10 years.
Matthias Muchnik, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Is coming then, so says Matthias. Now, as the global population balloons towards 9 billion, small-scale agriculture needs to rapidly climb the technology ladder. The farmers of the future will be armed with GPS monitoring devices, up-to-the-minute weather forecasts, and swarms of drones with sensors and digital imaging capabilities. Our next farms in Africa and in Asia. We're going to get right to our conversation with them, but first I want to bring you up to date on another audience poll. This is the question that we're asking now. What will be the most significant change to global dietary habits? And please, if you're watching on the platform, please do get involved. Please give us your thoughts on this, because there could be so many different ways that this thing moves. Do you think the shift towards plant-based foods is going to be most significant? Do you think we're going to see the second option, which is more insect protein? Or do you think we're going to see the expansion of cell-based meat and seafood from labs? We've been talking a little about that. Or do you think that animal protein demand will be on the rise still globally as emerging economies move up the income scale? So just mark your answers in the box on the right-hand side of the screen if you're watching the platform, that is, and I will read out the results in a few minutes' time. I'll bring that into our conversation next panel. And let's get straight to that. I want to introduce you to pleased to welcome Aloysius Attar, who is the co-founder of ZAG. Reminder to our audience, if you have any questions of your own for Justin or Aloysius, then please do get in touch with us. Please type them into the comment box, and I will do my best to weave those into our conversation as we go. So Aloysius and Justin, thank you so much for joining us. Aloysius, if I could start with you, and in fact, I'll ask you both this same sort of opening question. How did you both come to focus on agri-tech? Aloysius, you first.
Anna, thanks again for having me. When we started Farmerline a decade ago, many of the people that work at Farmerline have either worked on the farm or are one person away from a farm. And we started with one simple mission: create lasting profit for farmers everywhere. Farmers in places like Africa are currently feeding 1/3 of the world. When we get to 9 billion by 2050, they will have to increase production. In order for them to take on this enormous tax, Africa must consume about 8 times the fertilizer that they consume now and 6 times the seeds that they consume. Agritech technologies can play a significant role in supporting farmers to feed the future. They can reduce cost of farming in general. They can enable companies like Farmerline and governments across the continent to serve millions of farmers at the same time. And it can also help farmers make more impact and increase yield and make more money. And so that's why we decided to start with the angle of agri-tech to combine with traditional techniques of supporting farmers.
Okay, so that's Farmerline. Justin, how did you get into the business of agri-tech?
Actually, 10 years ago, I was a film producer making documentaries about wildlife and the environment. about 7 years ago, I come back to China and I visited a farm in northwest cotton farmland. And surprisingly, I saw the farmers holding the handheld devices and spraying chemicals on cotton. So we thought probably we can use some of the technologies to help farmers connect to the digital world we are living in. So I found my partner and we start designing drones and robots. Company is now turned into an agriculture technology company, and we also turned ourselves into tech-driven farmers.
Yeah, so Justin, sticking with you, you talk about technology there, and I was going to ask you, what is the most exciting technology that you see driving agriculture or being rolled out in China? And of course, your T-shirt speaks volumes that drones are your business, or part of your business. Where is the most exciting technology, do you think, in agri-tech at this point?
I think to connect the farmland, the farmers, and the rural economy in digital economy will be the biggest trend, and it will be a paradigm shift compared to the same. It will be the same to industrial revolution, because once you get all the farmers who are producing the food for our future connected to urbanization and digitalization, we will release a huge economy to drive the next growth for the global economy. The autonomous technology in the farmland, and it also helps protect the environment, reducing chemical use, and empowers the farmers, also increase the rural equality as well. So I think digitalization is the biggest trend.
Yes, Aloysius, let me come to you then on a similar theme. New technologies. I mean, your business is about technology because you bring certain technology and you enable technology for some farmers in Africa. But it's beyond technology, isn't it? But in terms of that technology, Aloysius, what is exciting to you about the African farming scene?
What is exciting about the African farming scene is leveraging a very simple mobile phone. Many farmers across the continent own phones that are now connected to the internet, own phones that only receive SMS and voice. And it is really amazing to leverage the power of this device to get really intimate with the farmer and then their farm in order to give them proven technologies like high quality fertilizer and seeds, help them to adopt best practices like zero to reduce tillage, intercropping, these practices that not only just enhance farmer yield, but then also protect the farmers against the impact of climate change.
And Aloysius, when you talk about increased fertilizer use, that can bring benefits. And of course, you're focusing on increasing yields. But many centuries of farming tell us that we need to be careful where these chemicals are used. So how do you make sure that this is done, fertilizer use is done in a sustainable fashion?
And it comes back to the education. So encouraging farmers to use organic fertilizer, encouraging farmers to do, to adopt the practices of zero to reduce tillage, encouraging farmers to adopt practices like, intercropping, encouraging them to plant trees like Glaricia that increase the organic matter on the soil, which protects them against climate change, which increases the soil moisture, hence increasing yield and reducing the cost of irrigation. These old school practices, although they've been invented over a century ago, are still very relevant today. I do think that the goal of digital tools is to get farmers closer to these proven old methods that already work. That's what we care about at this point.
Yeah, I was going to ask about what role education plays here. And Justin, do you see that as well? That, you might be delivering technology solutions, but you're also educating farmers or allowing education to be shared amongst groups of farmers when you're putting them together, allowing them to connect?
Yes, there is a very old Chinese saying that the two hardest thing in the world is one, give your concept to someone else, and also to take someone else's money to your pocket. So we are doing these two things here in China. Chinese holder economy in rural areas. So in order to make farmers drone ready, robots ready, and AI ready, you need to do a lot of education in the market before you actually can sell the drones to them, robots to them. So yes, we founded XAG Academy in 2016 in order to train the farmers to be able to operate our drones, but also to accept the concept for farming.
Yet you find, Justin, that because you're dealing with a lot of smallholders, and you talk there about the small plot sizes, are you able to have the impact that your technology can really deliver because plot sizes are so small in China?
Yes, the Chinese farmland compared with some other countries like Australia, Brazil, and America, the farmland sizes are quite small. In service them, you can't sell farmers giant machinery. Give them a service. For example, we train lots of young pilots go back to the farm, become drone pilots and robot operators, and they can deliver services rather than just sell them products. So by doing that, we can introduce the technology quickly to the farmers who can't afford expensive machineries, but they can afford the services.
And Aloysius, what do you find about the size of the small holdings that you're dealing with when it comes to the farmers across Africa that you support? Is it a problem that they operate on small holdings, or do you think the technology you provide allows them to get over any disadvantages that might come with that?
Well, the reality for the farmers here is that a lot of them farm on between 2 to 4 acres of farmland. Many of these lands are inherited, from the family. So these are reality. And what we try to do is to help farmers to maximize their yield on the same plot of land. And it goes back to your earlier question. How do we get farmers to adopt best practices? How do we get them to adopt proven technologies? Because if there's no adoption, there's no impact. So what we do is just try to ensure that we leverage the trust networks around the farmers, the field officers, people who understand and speak the languages that the farmers understand, leveraging agribusinesses to educate them to increase yield for the same plot of land that they own. And that way, they don't have to cut down more trees, they don't have to expand their farms, but they can help farmers to make more money over time on the same piece of land that they own.
Now, I want to go back to our polling question that we started this part of the programme with, because I'd really like to get your perspectives on this. We were asking about what will be the most habits, and we have the results of our poll, this polling the audience that is watching this Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst program. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, apologies to well, maybe this is good for the insect population, but not so many people thinking that the future is in more insect protein or in the expansion of cell-based meat and seafood from labs. That's interesting in itself. But there do seem to be quite a lot of people who think a shift towards a more plant-based diet or plant-based foods is coming down the track. And also a lot of people saying that animal protein demand will actually increase globally as emerging economies move up the income scale. And this is interesting. I'll come to you, Justin, on this, because I spent the last hour talking about climate change. And of course, agriculture and climate are so carefully linked. When you think about in the West, we talk a lot about moves more towards plant-based diets. But I know in a lot of other countries where people move up the income scale, we do see increased meat consumption. So what's the experience in China, or what's your view of what will happen in China over the next?
Okay. From what we see here in China, I can see both trends are happening. Cities, people tend to living more healthy lives and vegetables. But we do have 12 million people moving from the rural area to cities every year. The urbanization in the last 20 years is amazing here. And those people who have increased income, they are increasingly, their demand is increasing in animal proteins. And they just simply want to live a better life, to eat better food. So both trends are happening. From what our perspective is, the replacement of labor in the countryside is making the vegetables and grains much better quality, much higher quantity. So I think the supply, also the cost of the food here is reducing. So I think at the beginning for the next decade, the animal protein will increase, but later on, very soon, I think people will get into a more balanced diet.
Right, that's interesting from the Chinese perspective. Aloysius, what do you think then when you look ahead, say 10 years? What are the developments that you would expect to see? More plant-based diets or diets that focus on more meat because living standards have improved?
Yeah, so for us, like on the continent where animal-based diet, animal-based diet. But the plant-based diet is currently limited to the middle class. And my opinion is that as the middle class expands over time, then the demand for plant-based diet will increase because, like, we do have it in abundance. The education is the adoption is just not there at this point. For us, also, in my opinion, animal-based diet is mostly a cultural thing. So you see somebody like eating two boiled eggs because they could afford it. It's a sign that, like, I've moved up my income ladder and I can afford it, or I can get more meat. So as the education on health and then importance of plant-based diet increases, and then the middle class also expands, my opinion is that the demand for plant-based diet will also increase as well.
Justin, you've mentioned urbanization a couple of times, and I wanted to pick up on that with you. How is the move towards more technology in farming in China rubbing up against urbanization, or how does one impact the other? We've seen rapid urbanization in China over the last decades, and we've seen more technology in farming, and you're talking about a particular type of technology that you bring. Do you see younger people keen to stay in rural locations and get involved in a more technical looking farming, or are they still wanting to flood to China's cities?
As the technology is developing along with the urbanization trend, I think young people will have more choices in the future. First of all, in the farmland, you can see more and more drones, robots every year. So the manpower is dramatically replaced by those robots in the farmland. It reduces labor-intensive, tedious, and dangerous farm works. On the other side, higher tech or augmented technology means one young farmer can manage much bigger farmland than their previous generation farmers. So the income for individual younger farmer is much higher than the income compared with the older farmers in the past, which gives them, also encourage them to become a new generation farmers to manage bigger land. This also reduces the impact of the environment, as they are using those robots and drones and AI to do the spraying and the seeding and the broadcasting. They use less chemical, less seeds, less fertilizers, means the cost for farming is also reduced. So I think for the next decade, what's going to happen is a leftover job in the village anymore. The young generation tends to move back quite a lot.
Okay, that's a really interesting dynamic. Let me just get to an audience question which has come in, and I'll put this to both of you. I think, Aloysius, if I come to you first on this, we've had a question from somebody in the audience asking about what success you've had, or rather, what are the typical challenges that stand in the way of farmers adopting technology? So, Aloysius, what were the reasons why technology was not able to be adopted before Farmerline came along and introduced it to farmers? What are the barriers?
I think it comes down to education. So people have to understand how the technology helps them to succeed on their farm and how it helps them to make more money. Often the conversation about money making in agriculture is left to the side. So when people are telling farmers about how, best practices that improve the climate, they don't often make the connection back to how these technologies actually helps farmers to generate wealth from their farm. So there has to be enormous education on it. And then finally, the education channel or method chosen is also extremely important because it has direct correlation to adoption. If you are trying to teach a farmer about something, a farmer that is not online, a farmer that loves to express himself in Ghana, speaking in their native language is the first step, and leveraging the trust network that they have. So the agribusinesses, the field officers, leveraging that to educate them actually increases adoption as well. So the channel of education and increasing the education that is available has impact on all that we're talking about.
And Justin, your thoughts? What have been the barriers that have stopped farmers from adopting this technology up to now?
Yes, we did have barriers at the very beginning. It's hard to make farmers trust your tech. For example, the piece of farmland is the only income source. Trust you to spray chemicals on those plants using a drone is a very hard thing. So at the very beginning, we have to set up service companies by ourselves to provide the services and make even insurance by ourselves. But later on, we find out in the rural areas, the supply chain and distribution channel is not there. You have to build it. For example, who's going to teach farmers how to use the drones and robots, and who's going to repair those equipments once they have the problems, and who's going to help them to deliver those equipment to their farmland. It's all about the supply chain. So we have to also need to align with all the existing distributors like chemical resellers and agricultural machinery dealers to make sure they are on the same pace and to teach them how the technology will evolve so they can trust us and become our partners to help us promote technology together.
Trust and education then really important. Justin, thank you very much. Aloysius, thank you very much. Thanks so much for spending time with us here at Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. Justin Gong and Aloysius Attar. And congratulations, of course, to Aloysius and to Justin on being named 2021 Bloomberg New Economy Catalysts. So earlier we heard from Matthias Muchnik about how Notco is looking to create plant-based versions of animal protein. Now we want to take you to Singapore, where our What If catalyst, Dr. Sandhya Sriram, CEO and founder of Shiok Meats, is working to meet the growing demand for seafood by growing that seafood in a lab.
These dumplings are made of real shrimp meat. But instead of being farmed in water tanks or rivers, this shrimp is grown in the lab by Singapore-based startup Shiok Meats.
Globally, we are the only company working on cell-based shrimp and crab. Since we are making this from the actual cells to the DNA level, the nutrition as well as the taste is exactly the same as the original product.
Around the world, startups like Shiok Meats are racing to invent and improve alternatives to traditional meat production, which is often criticized for environmental and ethical reasons.
The advantages of using cellular agriculture to make seafood is that you don't need to set up large-scale farms or go into the oceans to catch these animals for human consumption, so environmentally friendly. There is very less greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions as well, and it's animal friendly because we don't slaughter the animals in large scale.
Plant-based meats are already here. Alternative proteins from homegrown insects are on the way. And now, with advances in technology, cell-based seafood could soon be coming to a table near you.
So ever since I've known, I was always intrigued by the human body. So I wanted to kind of know how the human body works, how does digestion happen, how does blood flow, how does the brain work, and all of that. And always imagined myself being in biology.
This passion brought Sandhya Sriram from her home country India to Singapore, where she got a PhD degree in biological science and co-founded 2 other tech companies before starting Shiok Meats in 2018.
I've been a vegetarian all my life for ethical, more environmental reasons. I just put my skill for biology and my love for food and my love for sort of saving this environment and doing my part in this world together, and said, why not grow seafood using stem cells?
Cultured meat is not new. In 2013, Dutch professor Mark Post created the world's first burger patty from cells. So far, more than 60 companies have joined this field, backed by increasing funding from investors. and the cell-based meat market is projected to reach $140 billion in the next decade. Cultured chicken developed by startup Eat Just was approved for commercial sale in Singapore last December, a first for a cultured meat product. But while many companies are working on cultured chicken, beef and duck meat, Shiok focuses on seafood.
So shrimp, crab and lobster alone makes about $150 billion worth of market share in the world. And Asia is the largest producer, consumer and exporter of these proteins. And it's well liked by all of us, and we consume a lot of crustaceans. So the process of growing cell-based meat or seafood involves 3 main steps. The first step is where you isolate the stem cells from live animals. These are the source cells of any animal, sort of the birth cell that can grow into any organ. And these cells are then put into large-scale tanks called bioreactors, which are pretty much like a brewery, but instead of brewing beer, it's brewing meats and seafood. And we feed these cells with liquid nutrients that convert these cells into the actual tissue, muscle, fat, connective tissue, and real meat at the end of the day that has the same taste, nutrition, and eventually the same texture and look as well.
Compared with farmed seafood, these cultured versions are friendlier to animals and the planet. Shiok Meat says growing cultured seafood is also at least 6 times faster than farming them. But it's pricey. A kilogram of cultured shrimp costs nearly $1,000 US. The key reason? The liquid nutrient solution that helps the seafood to grow is an expensive pharmaceutical product used to make things like vaccines.
When we started off, the liquid nutrient mix that we used to feed our cells used to be pharmaceutical grade because that was the only thing available out there. But what we have managed to do in 2.5 years is to swap out some of the chemicals with plant extracts or edible products that makes the food more nutritious and delicious as well. And eventually our process will involve 100% plant-based and edible nutrients. And we are aiming to be at about $50 per kilogram by the end of this year.
The company also faces another hurdle: how to make this novel lab-grown food appealing to customers.
We're looking forward to sort of breaking the myths that are out there and making people understand that this is the future and it's as safe for them as possible, and it's the same meat and seafood that they're used to eating.
Shiok Meats has raised over $20 million in funding and plans to launch their products within the next 2 years. Yet it might still take years, even decades, for cultured meat and seafood to go mainstream. But Shriram remains hopeful.
So our mission is to feed the 10 billion that we will be in the next couple of decades and the ever-growing population after that. As a consumer, you walk into a supermarket and you go to the frozen aisle of meat and seafood and you see everything from cell-based meat and seafood to plant-based meat and seafood and a small section of conventional meat and seafood. And that's sort of the vision for the entire industry and for Shiok Meats as well.
And that brings to an end part 1 of Bloomberg New Economy Catalyst. I really hope that you found all of these stories as inspiring as I have. Join us in 3 hours' time for part 2 of our programme, where we'll be meeting the catalysts that are changing the worlds of biotech and digital money.